past few years, I've seen more and more third-party lens manufacturers releasing their very first autofocusing lenses. And this is a huge deal because it brings together the low price of third-party lenses with the ease of use of autofocus. And keeping that train rolling, 7Artisans has released their first autofocus lens. This is their 50mm f1.8, and it's a full-frame lens. They first released it on Sony E-mount and now have released it on Nikon Z-mount, and I'll be reviewing it today on a Nikon Z7. Before we go any further into the video, I want to disclose to you that 7Artisans did send me this lens for the purpose of this review, but they don't get to look at the video, they don't get any input on what I get to say. All the opinions in this video are mine, but I wanted to disclose that to you out of fairness. So now we're on to the build quality of the 7Artisans 50mm f1.8, and the very first thing that kind of stands out about this is that it's absolutely huge for a 50mm lens. Usually 50mm lenses, even on a full frame, they're usually much more like a pancake lens than this. This thing is like a big beer can hunk of metal, but luckily it doesn't feel dense. For its big size, it's actually not very heavy. It doesn't feel as dense as a lot of 7Artisans manual focus lenses. The focus ring actually has some dampening, which is kind of a first. I haven't seen this very much on autofocusing lenses. My usual frame of reference for autofocusing first-party lenses is usually Fujifilm lenses, which have almost no resistance on the focus ring. So this is somewhat of a welcome surprise. I believe this should result in more smooth and repeatable focus pulls whenever you're using manual focus, despite this having focus by wire in it. The aperture also has that smooth resistance, which I would actually prefer for it to be clicked because this is mostly a photography lens. I don't really like seeing that smooth aperture, and I don't really like how much resistance it has either, but it is at least consistent with the focus ring. And probably the lowest quality switch on the lens is this autofocus manual focus lens switch, which I think is just way too easy to bump. I find even pulling it out of the bag or putting the lens onto the camera, this is easily bumped over to into manual focus or autofocus or whichever one I don't want it to be on, so I wish this had a bit more resistance on it. It's nice that it has this built-in lens hood. It's made of plastic, but it's not egregiously low quality, so it gets a pass from me. You'll see that the lens cap font is a little bit different than this font right here. It's like this one's in bold and then this one is not, and then this font even looks a little bit different on the lens hood, so I just wish there was a little bit more consistency with the graphic design, but that's not the end of the world. In the rear mount, this of course turns the opposite way of most lens caps because this is a Nikon mounted lens, and this is what it looks like on the back. A nice big rear element to cover the full frame sensor. We also have a USB-C port right here for updating firmwares, and we have contacts right here for our autofocus. This is what the lens looks like on my Nikon Z7. Again, yes, it is very big, but not that heavy because it's not a super dense lens. So it actually feels pretty comfortable on there, but the size is just a big honking thing on the end there, but at least it doesn't like pull on the front like that. If you can get on with the size, it's actually a pretty comfortable lens to shoot with. It feels nice in the hand. And now we're on to the image quality of the lens. First of all, it's a 50mm lens, so that makes it super useful. It's arguably the most useful focal length for the widest variety of subjects. I've heard some people say they didn't like the bokeh, but I personally found the bokeh to be okay. It doesn't take a lot to please me as long as it's not super jarring and distracting. There is a little bit of cat's eye bokeh in the corner, but generally you get a nice 3D separation. There is some vignetting wide open at f1.8 if you were to shoot a perfectly blue sky at f1.8. I don't know why you do that, but you would see some vignetting. I would say it's pretty much negligible in most real world scenarios. It's just going to put a little bit more emphasis on your subject in the middle of the frame, and unless you're shooting a test shot, you're not really even going to see it, and it's not really going to affect the image. And even if it does, you can just remove it with post corrections. Now, if you go looking for green and purple fringing in harsh situations on specular highlights, you'll probably find a little bit. I'd say with this level of fringing, it's pretty easy to remove in post. And when it comes to flare, there is some, especially if you're going to shoot wide open towards a strong light source like the sun. You can shield some of it off with your hand, but you're going to have to probably stop down a little bit to get rid of that flare altogether, or just try not to shoot towards that harsh light source, but I don't think the flare is that bad. You might be concerned with the autofocus performing from a lens manufacturer who's never before released an autofocusing lens, but I actually found the autofocus to be really quick and snappy, especially for single shot autofocus, which is what I usually use for my photography, especially portraits or anything like that. Whenever I put my focus point on the subject, it pretty much zipped right to it and got it in focus with very little latency, and it didn't really hunt to the background or do anything weird that I found. Despite the fact that I tested the lens on a 45 megapixel sensor, which is very demanding on my Nikon Z7, I still found photos even at f1.8 to be super sharp, even zooming in 200% on the eyeball, and of course as you stop down it gets even sharper. So for a nifty 50, even though it's not so nifty because of how big it is, I would say the image quality is perfectly good, especially considering this is a sub $200 lens. But the thing is, should you consider this if you have a Nikon Z camera? In my scenario, I've actually never owned a first-party Nikon Z lens yet. I've only had third-party manual focus lenses. So from my perspective of somebody who has a Nikon Z mount camera as kind of a secondary camera for mainly photography, I found this to be an excellent lens, but I cannot say that I've tried out the Nikon 51.8, which is much more expensive, or I guess a better competitor to compare this to would be the Nikon 40mm f2, which has pretty much the same exact aperture, only a third of a stop darker, and arguably a more useful focal length at a pretty much the same price, and it's a first-party Nikon brand. The thing about the Nikon 40 f2 is that it is plastic build, and it's not going to be as well built as this, but it's also going to be much smaller, and it's going to be by Nikon, so the optics are probably going to be on par, if not better. So in my scope of experience in this system, this is an excellent lens, and by far the best one I've tried so far. But is it a lens that you should buy? That's for you to decide based on what you currently have, what your goals are. For a lot of people who are going to use a 50mm lens often, and especially for professional work, I would say probably save up your money for the 50mm 1.8S. It's going to be much better. This is going to get you by as a beginner if you just want a quick cheap 50mm, but if you're buying a full frame system and you're like really investing into that, you might as well invest in the glass. That's the thing that's really going to make the quality of your images, not just the camera. So I would say depending on what kind of photographer you are, if you are a professional, if you're just casual, depending on what your goals are, this could or could not be a lens for you. That's really for you to decide. I'm not going to make a arching generalization of yeah, you should buy it or no, you shouldn't. But I think based on the information that I presented to you in this video, you can come to that conclusion on your own, hopefully. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions. I'm happy to help you and answer anything based on my experience with the lens. Anyone else who's tried it, let other people know what you think about it, and if you think there are better options out there or why this is a good option. Leave a like, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Peace.